Joshua chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. I grew up between the big metropolises, and tell me if you've ever heard these town names. Alexis and Orange Station. Y'all know where those big metropolises are? Yeah, you do? Okay. I mean, the metro area for these towns are so huge, I tell you. You know, at least Alexis has got a stoplight. Iron Station didn't even have one, right? But I grew up, just outside of Iron Station, and it was funny going off somewhere or even looking at colleges. Where are you from? Iron Station? What? How do you get that? In fact, one of my buddies, when he went off Chapel Hill, he said he tells a story about how he gave his address to his major department when he went home for the summer. They sent literature or whatever. And he said, no lie, he said, these people were laughing at me when I gave my address. He used to live on Hudson Poultry Road in Iron Station. And they, how redneck can you get, right? Well, the reason this Hudson Poultry Road used to be a chicken processing plant on Hudson Poultry Road. Iron Station, there's a reason why there's a name Iron Station, isn't it? Because at one point, Iron Station, with all its little iron mines and furnaces in Lincoln County, was a supplier of iron ore for the Confederacy at one point. Old Laboratory Mill Road, there was an old laboratory there that made medicine for the Confederacy. There's reasons behind these names. But of course, over time, as people have departed from the time that the significance was put upon these cities, the names are kind of like, why is it named that? Why is it called that? We're going to run into a town, or at least an area, a place in our story today, and we ask the question, what? How in the world did they get that name? You see, one of the things about these town names, Iron Station, Dallas has significance in its name. The Mariposa community has a significance in its name. I mean, all these little communities have significance in their name that remind us of something else. Maybe a greater time, a time of importance, significance. We're looking at a story today where a town receives an odd name, but the odd name is to remind the people of the commitment to God. A time when they renewed their devotion and their spirits toward God. It's got a weird name. I'm going to warn you ahead of time. And it's just the juvenile part of me that finds a laugh at it. But our story starts in the first few verses of chapter 5. This is verse 1, and as well as chapter 4. Now get a little bit of the story set up here, a little scene set up here, a little introduction. This part of Joshua, the Israelites have been wandering the wilderness for 40 years, and they're having all kinds of issues and struggles, and they finally get to the Promised Land. Moses is out of the scene. He's not allowed to go in the Promised Land, but Joshua is getting ready to take them in. At this point of our story, the Jordan River has dried up in a certain spot, allowing them to cross. Very reminiscent of the Exodus scene, the crossing of the Red Sea. So just as the crossing of the Red Sea gave the Israelites an opportunity for a new beginning, and they messed it up, this crossing of the Jordan gives them an opportunity for a new beginning. This new Exodus, this entering this promised land, this land that God has set aside for them, well, sort of set aside because there's already people there. We look at verse 1, it says, I'll tell you. There we go. I have all kinds of issues today. When the Amorite kings crossed the Jordan to the west, and all the Canaanite kings near the sea heard of how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the Israelites until they had crossed over, they lost heart, their courage failed because of the Israelites. This is a perfect time for Israel to start again. Because the stories maybe had trickled in the Promised Land of these Amorite kings and Canaanite kings, stories of how they had come out of Egypt, how they had bested the Egyptian army, and God had worked miracles of parting the Red Sea and crushing Pharaoh's soldiers. And they're getting ready to cross in this land. War is getting ready to happen. We know the rest of the story, Joshua, how they conquer cities and destroy them, and God allows them to live in this land, but these people are afraid. They lost their heart, and their courage failed them because the Israelites and their God. One of the things we're reminded of, just next chapter over in chapter 6, the conquest of Jericho, that by themselves Israel wasn't a very imposing army. By themselves they couldn't do it alone. How did they win Jericho? Through God's divine, miraculous help. And I'm sure the stories have filtered through the land of these people and their mighty, powerful God. And they quaked. Now the stories had preceded the children of Israel, but the children of Israel weren't quite ready to be the people that matched the story. Their devotion to God wasn't quite there. So we find in chapter 5, verse 2 and following, a renewal of this covenant by this thing called circumcision. And this is the Holman Christian Standard Translation, by the way. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelite men again." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelite men. Now, I'm going to mispronounce this. Gibeat Har-Arlot. Okay? A few things going on in this section here I want us to flesh out a little bit. Notice that God comes to Joshua and tells him to take these flint knives. Now they had knives, metal knives, but why a flint knife? They didn't have to have a flint knife. The flint knife reminds them that this is an ancient ritual. This act of circumcision, this act of renewal of covenant with God, points back to an ancient God and our ancient ways, our old traditions, our old something bigger and deeper than us in this moment. The flint knives remind them of that. And the circumcision is something that sets them apart. Circumcision, while some other cultures practice it, Israel, they stuck out amongst the others, amongst the Canaanites for the most part, and the Amorites, and all these other peoples of the land, because they were circumcised. The tradition goes back to Abraham. Abraham circumcised Isaac on the 8th day in Genesis 21. Leviticus 12:3, the people are commanded to circumcise their children on the 8th day. This sets them apart, makes them different from the people around them. You see, one of the things that God calls His people to do is to be a holy people. In our society today, we often get that confused. Even Christians get this confused. We think holy means we have to be perfect and live spotless and blameless and do everything right and just be perfect. That's not necessarily what holy means. Holy, in the sense of the Old Testament, means to be set apart, to be different in some ways. Not to be like the world. But oftentimes, we Christians get so enmeshed in the world that you can't tell us apart. It's like those old blind taste tests. You see these commercials, or go to the grocery store, you see this. You know, you like product A or product B, and one's pulled off, one's a Coke, one's a Pepsi. Which one do you like better? Sometimes you can't tell the difference, these taste tests. With we Christians, with God's people, people should see the difference. We should be set apart. Maybe if we're not different from this world, maybe it's a time for us to renew our commitment to God. Just like the Israelites who were circumcised. Now to this name of this town, the Gibeat Har-Arlot, it literally means hill of the foreskins. Now, if you're going to try to buy some real estate, I wouldn't recommend buying real estate in a town named Hill of the Foreskins. Somebody may not want to live there. Okay? Just something about that name just kind of seems weird, right? Again, I told you that the juvenile part of me finds a laugh at this. But this area, this place was named this, and you find throughout the Old Testament there's other places where the names take significance as a reminder to people in later generations. This hill was named this to remind later generations that God had renewed the people had renewed their commitment to God here. It's a signpost, it's a marker, it's like these historical markers you find on the side of the road in significant places in North Carolina. You're reminding us of something that happened of importance. This name of this place is a signpost for Israel to remind them to be committed to God. To renew their commitment to God. Just like over in chapter 4, when they crossed the Jordan, they set up these 12 stones as markers to remind them of the event of the crossing. This name of this place, this hill of the foreskins, as odd as it may sound, was to remind them of their renewal to God. You know, we need signposts in our life. Things to remind us of God. Things to remind us that our commitment to God is important. After my family and I leave here in a little bit, we're going to go to the family reunion. It's the reunion is the descendants of Abraham Lincoln Grigg, Abe Grigg. And I will probably see a bunch of pictures of me as a youngin'. I'll see a bunch of pictures of people that have long since gone to the Lord that remind me of times past. And I'll probably be in tears seeing pictures of my grandparents and other loved ones have gone on because I remember the things used to be. How things could be. And of course, always the past seems a little better when you think about it in retrospect, doesn't it? You don't necessarily remember the hard times, you remember the good times. But we need markers in our lives to remind us of God working in our lives and our renewed commitment. Maybe we don't even think about those times when God has worked in our life. Well, keep that in mind. Let's look at the old crowd, the new crowd, the reason for the circumcision. This is the reason Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt, who were males, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. They had come out of Egypt, excuse me. They, all the people who came out, were circumcised. None of the people born in the wilderness along the way were circumcised after they'd come out of Egypt. Why? For the Israelites wandered in the wilderness 40 years until all the nation's men of war who came out of Egypt had died off because they had not obeyed the Lord. So the Lord vowed never to let them see the land He had sworn to their fathers to give us a land flowing with milk and honey. Why was there no circumcision? Why had the covenant not been kept up with God? Because, well, for one thing, the old crowd had been disobedient. Think back to the story of Exodus, the whole story recounted in Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Exodus. This whole story of how these people rebelled. They were stubborn. I mean, they were whining and groaning and moaning about every turn of the way. Oh, the food was so much better in Egypt. We had so much better in Egypt. You were slaves in Egypt. You were beaten and oppressed in Egypt. Oh, but things are so much better. Moses even, so fed up, struck a rock and drew water. At one point, disobeying God. But one of the kickers of disobedience in the wilderness was while Moses was up on Mount Sinai receiving the commandments from God. Oh, he'd been gone, oh, too long. Oh, it's too long. He's gone. He's dead. There's something wrong. So all the people get together. Guess what they do? They make these golden calf idols. The irony is, while their leader is up meeting with God Himself, they're down in the valley making these golden calf idols. How disobedient can you get? I ask that question kind of rhetorically because, think about it. We are pretty disobedient at times, aren't we, too? Well, they should have had faith and stayed and been patient on God while Moses was on the mountaintop. They lost faith. How many times do we need to keep our faith in God through the hard times of life, the trying times of life, when we just give up? Even some people in the easy times of life just give up. They're disobedient. We're stiff-necked people. And I'm just kind of like the rest of us. I mean, I think the Israelites were Baptist. Because they moaned and they groaned and complained. And they were just wild, disobedient people. I resemble that remark, right? But they needed they did not circumcise the next generation. Joshua raised up their sons in their place, and it was there he circumcised. They were still uncircumcised since they had not been circumcised along the way. The older generation had fallen down on the job. In the midst of their disobedience and sin, they had not raised up a generation that was devoted to God. At least not outwardly devoted. They were still uncircumcised. So with this ritual, they renewed their devotion and allegiance to God. How many times have we dropped the ball and not prepared the next generation, disciple them and mentoring them? It's happened not just in this church, but other churches as well. Trust me. There's not enough mentorship and discipling of the next generation, allowing them to take roles of leadership, not allowing them to even know the basics. We're falling down the job, people. People wonder why churches are dying off and dying out. And some of the reason is we're not raising up the next generation. One of the things I was convinced of in my last church where I was youth minister was, we talk about the children, the youth, the teenagers being the church of the future. That's not true. Children and teenagers are the church today. They can do just as much and just as well as some church members, adult church members. We don't need to look at the next generation in the church of the future. We need to look at them as being the church today. And value them and prize them and allow them to serve God however God opens doors for them to serve. But notice that this circumcision caused a moment of vulnerability and forgiveness. Notice verses 8 and 9 here. After the entire nation had been circumcised, they stayed where they were in the camp until they recovered. Circumcision, the healing process, left warriors very vulnerable. They could have been attacked by these kings whose knees were shaking, these Canaanite kings who knew that Israel was coming with their mighty God. They could have attacked and wiped out the warriors, killed the people in this moment of their vulnerability. But God knew what He was doing when He allowed this fear to invade the hearts of the Canaanite kings. God's working. But notice that while they were covering their weak, vulnerable moment, look what happens, verse 9. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the disgrace of Egypt from you. Therefore, that place is called Gilgal to this day." You see, in their moment of weakness, in the moment where warriors of other peoples could come in and kill them, a moment of vulnerability physically and maybe spiritually, God forgave them and gave them grace. He rolled away the disgrace, the disobedience of Egypt. I forgive you. Even in our weakest moments, that's where God works the best, isn't it? Even when we get down to the bottom of life, God works the best because we have nowhere else to turn. Israel needed this moment of vulnerability to be able to go to God properly. They needed it. We find another act of commitment in the passage today. It's a celebration of the Passover. While the Israelites camped at Gilgal in the plains of Jericho, they kept the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month. Now they've been circumcised, this ancient ritual. This thing goes back to a greater time, a time of commitment. The Passover as well is another ritual that reminds them of God's past acts. You see, the Passover is a reminder of the time when God sent the plagues on Egypt, and the one plague of the death of the firstborn male child, and how when they painted the blood on the doorpost, the angel of death passed over that house. It's a celebration, a reminder of God's grace, God's mercy, and God's work in the past. You see, Israel celebrated that because they had been circumcised. They renewed their covenant to God. And the day after Passover, they ate unleavened bread and roasted grain from the produce of the land. You see, we need these things in our life to remind us of God working, and remind us of the significance of God, the old traditions and customs, the old ways. This modern world can't go on without God. We need God. We can't forget that. The last verse here too. The day after they ate from the produce of the land, the manna ceased. Since there was no more manna for the Israelites, they ate from the crops of the land of Canaan that year. You see, God was spiritually working and physically working with the people with the circumcision, the renewal of the Passover, the renewal of the covenant. They no longer needed God's manna. They're becoming mature enough to eat the crops of the land. They needed God. But God gave them meat and potatoes. You know, the whole babies drink milk, mother's milk, hopefully. New Christians, they needed the milk. As we mature into faith, He said to move on to the meat and potatoes, the deep things. See, the Israelites are no longer dependent on the manna. They're ready for God and bigger things. You see, this Lenten season is a good time to re-examine our commitment to God. Just as the Israelites renewed their commitment to God with circumcision and the Passover, we must be obedient and recommit ourselves to God. To examine how God has worked in the past. You see, despite the sins of the past, the mistakes of the past, God has made a way. The cross of Jesus and His blood offers a chance to begin again. But we must commit or recommit ourselves to Him. Just as Israel moved on from the manna, God puts us back on our feet to where we are spiritually able to be competent in the world. In fact, just as God used the recommittal of Israel to prepare them for Jericho and other battles, He prepares us for spiritual battle. The Israelites needed the circumcision, this recommitment, to be able to survive in the new land and the battles they would fight. We as Christians need to recommit ourselves spiritually to God, to the old ways, His old faith, His old-timey religion, to be able to meet the needs of this world around us, to fight the spiritual battles in front of us. Today's St. Patty's Day. Some of you are wearing green, some of you aren't. I'm not. Because I got up this morning. Actually, when I got clothes last night, I forgot today's St. Patty's Day. But I think pink is a new green, right? But one of the great things that's coming out of the tradition of St. Patrick's Day that I found is the what's called St. Patrick's breastplate, the prayer of St. Patrick. And I found this version I'm going to read to you today. And of course, it's been translated and written down differently, but I'm going to read some excerpts from it. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. I arise today through the strength of Christ's birth with His baptism, through the strength of His crucifixion with His burial, through the strength of His resurrection with His ascension, through the strength of His descent from judgment of doom. I arise today through the strength of heaven, the light of the sun, the radiance of the moon, the splendor of fire, the speed of lightning, the swiftness of wind, the depth of the sea, the stability of the earth, the firmness of rock. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's eye to look before me, God's ear to hear me, God's word to speak for me, God's hand to guard me, God's shield to protect me, God's host to save me from the snares of devils, from temptation of vices, from everyone who shall wish me ill, afar and anear. It goes on to say, Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I rise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. This prayer is over 1,500 years old. Around 1,500 years old. You know, as much as we want to think about the future, our past is so rich. We need things like the prayer of St. Patrick. We need things like the names of the town, the Hill of the Foreskins, to remind us that there are elements of the old ways that are important. There's an ancient God that's important. God hasn't changed. Our culture may change. The tools of the trade may change. But God's still the same. He's an ancient God who loves us. But we must recommit ourselves ever so often, because we fall off the wagon. We must recommit ourselves to follow Him, just as maybe older generations have done. You need to recommit yourself today, I'm sure. We all do every now and then. I encourage you to recommit yourself, to follow God daily, to make anew the covenant, the promise with Him. The altar's open if you'd like to pray in a moment. But seek God this day and forever. This Lenten season of examination. See what's going on in your life. And see if God's there. If He's not, He needs to be. As we